A white cop confidently smirks as he testifies against a black defendant. But everything flips when the defendant calmly says, "Play the tape." What happens next shocks everyone. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video and comment on where you're watching from. Let's get started. The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of courtroom 217, casting long shadows across the polished oak floors. Officer Michael Brennan adjusted his crisp blue uniform as he took the witness stand, the weight of his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere permeating the room. At the defense table sat Marcus Washington, a 28-year-old black man dressed in a borrowed suit that hung slightly loose on his frame. His shoulders were squared, his expression carefully neutral despite the gravity of the charges against him: assault on a police officer and resisting arrest, charges that could send him to prison for years. Judge Eleanor Harmon glanced over her reading glasses at the prosecution. "You may proceed, Ms. Galloway." District Attorney Sarah Galloway rose from her seat, her tailored suit and confident stride projecting authority as she approached the witness stand. "Officer Brennan, please state your name and position for the record." "Michael Brennan, patrol officer with the West Ridge Police Department, 5 years on the force." His voice carried easily through the courtroom, practiced and assured. "And could you please describe for the court the events of April 15th that led to the arrest of the defendant, Marcus Washington?" Brennan straightened, his face settling into the serious expression he'd perfected for courtroom testimony. "I was conducting a routine patrol on Maple Street around 11:30 p.m. when I observed the defendant acting suspiciously near the entrance of the Corner Market convenience store." "Could you elaborate on what you mean by acting suspiciously?" Galloway prompted. "He was pacing back and forth, repeatedly looking through the store window, then checking up and down the street. Classic casing behavior. When the store owner made eye contact with him through the window, the defendant quickly walked away." Marcus shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. His court-appointed attorney, David Chen, scribbled notes without looking up. "What did you do next, Officer Brennan?" Galloway continued. "I pulled my patrol car alongside him and asked him to stop for questioning. He immediately became agitated, refused to provide identification, and attempted to walk away despite my clear instructions to remain where he was." The district attorney nodded encouragingly. "And then what happened?" "I exited my vehicle and again requested identification. At this point, the defendant became verbally abusive, shouting profanities and accusing me of harassment." Brennan's voice remained steady, professional. "When I attempted to detain him for questioning, he suddenly shoved me backward with both hands and attempted to flee the scene." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Marcus Washington's mother, seated in the front row behind her son, closed her eyes briefly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I pursued on foot," Brennan continued, "and when I caught up to him, he resisted arrest, striking me in the chest with his elbow during the struggle. It took considerable effort to subdue him and apply handcuffs." "Did you sustain any injuries during this encounter, Officer Brennan?" "Minor bruising to my chest and a sprained wrist from the struggle." Galloway paced slowly before the witness stand. "In your professional opinion, was the level of force you used appropriate for the situation?" "Absolutely." Brennan's tone was firm, without hesitation. The defendant was combative and posed a genuine threat. "I used only the force necessary to ensure my safety and effect the arrest." "Thank you, Officer Brennan." Galloway turned toward the defense table, a subtle smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "Your witness, Mr. Chen." David Chen rose slowly, adjusting his glasses as he approached the stand. At 32, he was relatively inexperienced, especially compared to Galloway's decade in the DA's office. But what he lacked in years, he made up for in thoroughness. "Officer Brennan, You testified that you observed Mr. Washington pacing back and forth outside the store. How long did you observe him before initiating contact? Brennan shifted slightly. Approximately 2 minutes. 2 minutes, Chen repeated. And in those 2 minutes you determined he was casing the establishment rather than, say, waiting for someone? Based on my training and experience, yes or no, officer? Did you actually see Mr. Washington commit any crime during those 2 minutes? No, but... And this convenience store, the corner market, it's a bus stop location, isn't it? A flicker of annoyance crossed Brennan's face. Yes. So a person waiting for a bus might pace, might look up and down the street checking for their bus, might even look inside the store to check the time on the wall clock. All perfectly innocent behaviors, wouldn't you agree? In some contexts, yes. But let's move on, Chen interrupted. You stated Mr. Washington became verbally abusive when you approached him. Could you recall his exact words? Brennan straightened his shoulders. He asked why I was stopping him, then said, "This is bullshit, and you're just harassing me because I'm black." Did he use any actual threats toward you? His tone was threatening. That wasn't my question, officer. Did Marcus Washington verbally threaten you with harm at any point? Brennan's jaw tightened. Not explicitly, no. Chen walked to the defense table, picking up a document. I have here the bus schedule for April 15th. It shows that a bus was due at that stop at 11:34 p.m., approximately 4 minutes after you initiated contact with Mr. Washington. Were you aware of this? I was not concerned with the bus schedule. Just answer the question, officer. No, I was not aware. Chen nodded, placing the schedule down. You also testified that Mr. Washington shoved you with both hands. Are you certain about that detail? Yes. Brennan's response was immediate, confident. A small smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, almost imperceptible, but not to those watching closely. He planted both hands on my chest and shoved forcefully. Chen's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in his posture. And you're willing to swear, under oath, that this is exactly what happened? I am. The smirk became more pronounced. I think I'd remember being assaulted. From the defense table, Marcus Washington suddenly straightened, his composure cracking for the first time. He leaned toward his attorney, whispering urgently. Chen listened, then nodded once, his eyes never leaving the officer on the stand. Officer Brennan, Chen continued, his voice taking on a new edge. Are you aware that the corner market installed new security cameras 3 weeks before this incident? Brennan blinked, the smirk faltering slightly. I wasn't directly involved in that upgrade. But you're familiar with the store, correct? You patrol that area regularly? Yes. Then perhaps you noticed the new camera positioned above the entrance, with a clear view of the bus stop where you encountered my client. The courtroom fell silent. Brennan's eyes darted briefly toward the prosecutor's table, where Galloway was suddenly very still, her expression unreadable. I don't recall specifically noting any cameras that night, Brennan replied, his voice slightly less assured. Chen turned toward the judge. Your Honor, the defense would like to introduce Exhibit D into evidence. Security footage from the corner market on the night of April 15th, covering the time period of Mr. Washington's arrest. Judge Harmon nodded. Proceed. As the bailiff moved to set up the video equipment, Marcus Washington leaned back in his chair, his eyes locked on Officer Brennan. For the first time since the trial began, a flicker of something like hope crossed his face. Brennan's confident posture had vanished, replaced by a rigid stillness. The smirk was gone. David Chen approached the witness stand once more. Officer Brennan, before we play this tape, I'll ask you once more. Do you stand by your testimony that Mr. Washington shoved you with both hands and later struck you with his elbow? The fluorescent lights hummed in the silence that followed. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Brennan began, then stopped, swallowing hard. My report reflects my recollection of events. Marcus Washington spoke then, his voice quiet but clear enough to carry through the hushed courtroom. Play the tape. The bailiff dimmed the lights as the large screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. The security footage was grainy but clear enough. A wide-angle view of the storefront, the bus stop, and the adjacent sidewalk illuminated by streetlights and the neon glow from the corner market sign. Officer Brennan's hands gripped the edge of the witness stand, his knuckles whitening as the timestamp in the corner of the screen showed 11:28 p.m. Marcus Washington appeared at the edge of the frame, walking at a normal pace before stopping at the bus stop. He checked his watch, looked down the street in the direction a bus would come from, then stepped closer to the store window, likely checking the time on the wall clock inside, just as Chen had suggested. The courtroom was utterly silent as they watched Washington repeat this sequence: check watch, look for bus, glance in store, without any of the suspicious pacing or casing behavior Brennan had described. At 11:30 p.m., a patrol car pulled into view, stopping alongside the bus stop. The angle captured Washington's face clearly as he turned toward the vehicle, showing surprise rather than guilt. Officer Brennan emerged from the car, his body language immediately aggressive. Though the footage had no audio, it was evident from Washington's gestures that he was explaining something, pointing down the street, then at the bus stop sign. Brennan moved closer, into Washington's personal space, finger jabbing toward his chest. Washington took a step back, hands raised slightly in a universal gesture of de-escalation. His mouth moved rapidly. He was clearly trying to explain something. Then Brennan grabbed his arm, spinning him around toward the patrol car. Washington didn't resist, but appeared to be protesting verbally. The critical moment came next. As Brennan attempted to push Washington against the vehicle, Washington stumbled slightly. His hands never touched the officer's chest. There was no shove, no aggressive movement at all. Instead, it was Brennan who suddenly grabbed Washington by the collar and threw him to the ground with excessive force. The footage showed Washington lying face down, arms spread out to his sides, offering no resistance as Brennan kneeled on his back, yanking his arms behind him with unnecessary roughness. At no point did Washington elbow the officer or make any aggressive move. As the video ended, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. Judge Harmon's expression had turned to stone. Across the room, members of the jury exchanged glances. In the front row, Mrs. Washington pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, tears streaming silently down her face. David Chen broke the silence. "Officer Brennan, would you care to reconcile this footage with your testimony?" Brennan swallowed hard. His earlier confidence evaporated. The camera angle doesn't show everything. There was a struggle before... Before what, officer? Before the moment you claimed Mr. Washington shoved you with both hands? The moment we just watched, where no such thing occurred? I felt threatened. His posture was... His posture? Chen's voice rose slightly. The jury can see his posture for themselves. Hands visible, no sudden movements, attempting to communicate with you. From the prosecution table, D.A. Galloway rose. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is testifying." "Sustained," Judge Harmon said. Though her gaze remained fixed on Brennan, her expression troubled. "Mr. Chen, ask a question, or move on." Chen nodded. "Officer Brennan, the footage shows no shove with both hands as you testified. It shows no elbow to your chest. It shows my client waiting for a bus, attempting to explain that to you, and then being thrown to the ground despite offering no resistance. Is that a fair assessment of what we all just witnessed?" Brennan's face had flushed deep red. The situation was escalating. I had to make a split-second decision based on, "Yes or no, officer? Does the video contradict your sworn testimony about being shoved and elbowed?" A long pause. "The video doesn't show the full context," Chen sighed, turning to address the judge. Your Honor, I ask that the witness be directed to answer the question. Judge Harmon leaned forward. Officer Brennan, please answer the question directly. Does the video we just viewed contradict your earlier testimony regarding the defendant's actions? Brennan's jaw worked silently for a moment. It appears to show a different sequence of events. Thank you, Chen said, though there was no gratitude in his tone. Now, Officer Brennan, this isn't the first time you've had complaints filed against you for excessive force, is it? Objection. Galloway was on her feet instantly. Irrelevant and prejudicial. Your Honor, Chen countered, the officer's credibility is directly at issue here, as is a pattern of behavior that speaks to bias. Judge Harmon considered for a moment. I'll allow it, but tread carefully, Counselor. Chen turned back to Brennan. Officer, how many civilian complaints have been filed against you in your 5 years on the force? Brennan's lips pressed into a thin line. I don't know the exact number. Would it surprise you to learn it's 17? 17 complaints, 9 of which specifically cite excessive force against black men between the ages of 18 and 30? The gallery behind them stirred. Marcus Washington sat motionless at the defense table, his eyes never leaving Brennan's face. Complaints aren't findings of wrongdoing, Brennan replied stiffly. None resulted in disciplinary action. None resulted in disciplinary action, Chen repeated slowly. Let's talk about that. Your supervisor, Sergeant James Reynolds, dismissed all those complaints, correct? He reviewed them according to department procedure. The same Sergeant Reynolds who was quoted in your last performance review as saying you show, and I quote, exemplary initiative in proactive crime prevention through assertive patrol techniques. Is that correct? Yes. Chen walked back to the defense table, picking up another document. Officer Brennan, are you familiar with the Westridge Police Department's disproportionate contact statistics from the last 3 years? Brennan shifted uncomfortably. I'm aware of the general data. The general data, Chen echoed. The data showing that black residents make up 14% of Westridge's population, but account for 67% of discretionary stops by police. The data showing that force is used in 28% of encounters with black residents compared to 6% with white residents. He paused. Where do your personal statistics fall within that range, officer? I don't track my stops by race, Brennan replied, his voice tight. Fortunately, the department does, Chen said, sliding the document into evidence. Your personal statistics show you've stopped black residents at a rate nearly double the department average, and you've used force in 43% of those encounters. He let that sink in before continuing. One final question, Officer Brennan. Were you aware that Marcus Washington has a master's degree in education and was recently hired as a high school history teacher? Brennan blinked, caught off guard by the change in direction. No. Were you aware he has no criminal record? No, Were you aware he was waiting for the 11:34 bus to take him home after meeting with a student's parents about college applications? I had no way of knowing. Were you aware, Chen pressed on, that the suspicious looking through the window was him checking the time because his phone had died earlier that evening? Brennan's expression hardened. As I said, I observed what appeared to be suspicious behavior. Chen nodded slowly. Yes, you did say that. He turned toward the jury box. No further questions, Your Honor. As Chen returned to his seat, D.A. Galloway rose quickly. Redirect, Your Honor? Judge Harmon checked her watch. It's getting late. We'll resume with your redirect in the morning, Ms. Galloway. She addressed the jury. Court is adjourned until 9 a.m. tomorrow. The usual admonishments apply. Do not discuss this case among yourselves or with others. As the courtroom began to empty, Marcus leaned toward Chen. Thank you, he said quietly. For the first time since this happened, Someone actually saw me. Chen nodded, gathering his papers. It's not over yet. Galloway will try to salvage Brennan's testimony tomorrow, find some way to explain away the video. But the jury saw it, Marcus insisted. They can't unsee it. No, Chen agreed, glancing toward the prosecution table where Galloway was speaking intensely with Brennan. They can't. Outside the courtroom, journalists had already gathered, alerted by courthouse sources about the dramatic turn of events. As Chen and Marcus emerged, camera flashes erupted around them. No comment at this time, Chen stated firmly, guiding Marcus through the crowd. Behind them, Mrs. Washington walked slowly, her dignity intact despite her tears. A reporter thrust a microphone toward her. Mrs. Washington, how do you feel about the video contradicting the officer's testimony? She paused, composing herself. My son is a good man, a teacher. All I ever wanted was for the truth to come out. Her voice strengthened. Today, it finally started to. News of the security footage spread like wildfire through Westridge overnight. By morning, a small crowd had gathered outside the courthouse, some holding handmade signs reading, "Justice for Marcus" and "Cameras don't lie." Local television crews set up their equipment on the courthouse steps, reporters delivering updates against the backdrop of growing public interest. Inside, Marcus Washington sat at the defense table, his borrowed suit replaced by one that fit properly, a gift from his mother's church community delivered late the previous night. The physical transformation was subtle but significant. He looked more like the respected teacher he was than a defendant fighting for his freedom. David Chen was reviewing his notes when District Attorney Galloway entered, accompanied not just by her usual assistant, but by Richard Hargrove, the county's chief prosecutor. Their hushed conversation and grave expressions suggested the case had escalated beyond a routine prosecution. Judge Harmon called the court to order precisely at 9 a.m. Ms. Galloway, you may proceed with your redirect examination of Officer Brennan. Brennan returned to the witness stand, his uniform as crisp as the day before, but his demeanor markedly different. Gone was the casual confidence, replaced by a tightly controlled professionalism. Galloway approached, her strategy evident in her opening question. Officer Brennan, law enforcement officers are trained to perceive threats that might not be apparent to civilians or captured fully on camera. Could you explain how your training affected your assessment of the situation with Mr. Washington? Yes, Brennan replied, visibly relieved at the lifeline. We're trained to recognize pre-attack indicators, subtle body language, eye movements, tension patterns that suggest someone might become violent. These cues can be difficult to capture on video, especially from a distance or a fixed angle. And did you observe such indicators in Mr. Washington's behavior? I believe I did. His stance shifted when I approached, his hands moved in and out of his pockets, and he displayed what we call target glancing, looking around for escape routes or witnesses. Chen scribbled notes rapidly, his expression skeptical. So even though the video doesn't clearly show aggressive actions, you perceived an imminent threat based on your training? That's correct. Officer safety is paramount, and we're taught to trust our instincts in potentially volatile situations. Galloway nodded sympathetically. Let's address the discrepancy between your testimony and the video regarding the alleged push. Is it possible that your memory of the sequence of events was affected by the stress of the situation? Brennan hesitated, then seized the opportunity. Yes, that's possible. Studies show that stress can impact memory formation, especially during rapidly evolving incidents. I genuinely believed Mr. Washington pushed me, but I acknowledge the video shows a different sequence. Thank you for your candor, Galloway said. One final question. In your professional assessment, would a reasonable officer in your position have considered Mr. Washington's behavior suspicious enough to warrant investigation? Absolutely, Brennan said, regaining some confidence. The time of night, the location's history of robberies, and his behavior all warranted a stop under reasonable suspicion standards. Thank you, officer. No further questions. Judge Harmon turned to the defense. Mr. Chen, recross? Chen rose immediately. Just a few questions, Your Honor. He approached the witness stand, his demeanor calm but focused. Officer Brennan, you just testified about pre-attack indicators that justified your actions. If Mr. Washington was displaying these threatening behaviors, why didn't you mention them in your original testimony yesterday? Brennan's jaw tightened. I was focusing on the primary physical confrontation. Interesting, Chen remarked. You had time to describe his suspicious pacing and classic casing behavior, details the video directly contradicts, but not these crucial pre-attack indicators that supposedly justified your use of force. Objection. Argumentative, Galloway called. Sustained, Judge Harmon ruled. Rephrase, counselor. Chen nodded. Officer Brennan, your department's policy requires documenting all factors that lead to use of force, correct? Yes. Please show the court where in your incident report you documented these pre-attack indicators. Chen handed him a copy of his own report. Brennan flipped through the pages, finding nothing. I may not have used that specific terminology. In fact, you didn't mention them at all, did you? Chen pressed. Not in your report, not in your deposition, not in your testimony yesterday. These indicators only appeared after video evidence contradicted your original account. Objection. Galloway was on her feet. Counsel is badgering the witness. I'm establishing the timeline of Officer Brennan's evolving testimony, Your Honor, Chen countered. It's directly relevant to credibility. Judge Harmon considered for a moment. Overruled, the witness will answer. Brennan's face had flushed again. I observed these indicators in real time. The fact that I didn't document them specifically doesn't mean they weren't present. One last question, Chen said. The corner market has been robbed 3 times in the past year, correct? Yes, Brennan answered, seemingly relieved by the change in topic. And in all 3 cases, the suspects were described as white males in their 20s, weren't they? The silence that followed was damning. Finally, Brennan answered, Yes. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Harmon turned to the witness. Officer Brennan, you're excused. As Brennan stepped down, she addressed the attorneys. Ms. Galloway, call your next witness. Galloway stood, her expression revealing her diminishing confidence in the case. The prosecution calls Sergeant James Reynolds. Reynolds strode to the witness stand, the very picture of authoritative law enforcement, 20 years on the force evident in his bearing. After being sworn in, he settled into the chair with the ease of someone who had testified dozens of times before. Galloway established his credentials, his supervisory role over Officer Brennan, and his arrival at the scene after Washington's arrest. She then pivoted to damage control. Sergeant Reynolds, based on your experience and your review of this incident, was Officer Brennan's initial stop of Mr. Washington justified? In my professional opinion, yes, Reynolds answered without hesitation. That area has seen increased criminal activity recently. Officers are encouraged to proactively investigate suspicious behavior, and Officer Brennan was acting within department guidelines. And regarding the use of force, even considering the video evidence we've seen, Reynolds squared his shoulders. Use of force decisions are made in split seconds under stress. What might appear excessive to civilian eyes often represents necessary caution from a law enforcement perspective. I've reviewed Officer Brennan's actions and found them to be within acceptable parameters given the totality of circumstances. Galloway nodded gratefully. No further questions. Chen approached the witness stand, his expression thoughtful. Sergeant Reynolds, you supervise Officer Brennan directly, correct? That's correct. And you review civilian complaints against him? Yes, along with other officers under my command. Chen consulted his notes. In the past 5 years, you've reviewed 17 complaints against Officer Brennan and dismissed all 17. Is that accurate? Reynolds shifted slightly. Each complaint was investigated according to department procedures. That wasn't my question, Sergeant. Did you dismiss all 17 complaints? Yes, but... And of those 17 complaints, how many came from black residents of Westridge? Reynolds hesitated. I don't recall the exact breakdown. Chen handed him a document. Perhaps this will refresh your memory. It's the department's own tracking data. Reynolds glanced at the paper. According to this, 14 complaints came from black residents. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Marcus Washington watched intently, his expression a careful mask. 14 out of 17, Chen repeated for emphasis. And in your performance review of Officer Brennan just 3 months ago, you praised his proactive policing techniques. What exactly did you mean by that term? I meant his ability to identify and intervene in potential criminal activity before it occurs. Even when that potential criminal activity is a high school teacher waiting for a bus? Objection, Galloway called. Argumentative. Sustained, Judge Harmon ruled. Mr. Chen, be more precise in your questioning. Chen nodded. Sergeant Reynolds, are you aware that your department's own data shows black residents are stopped at nearly 5 times the rate of white residents in Westridge? I'm aware of the statistics, yes. And as a supervisor, what have you done to address this disparity? Reynolds straightened defensively. Statistics don't account for all relevant factors, such as crime patterns and deployment decisions. So nothing then, Chen said quietly. No further questions. As Sergeant Reynolds stepped down from the witness stand, a palpable tension hung in the courtroom. The prosecution's case was unraveling, thread by thread, exposed by video evidence and Chen's methodical questioning. Chief Prosecutor Hargrove leaned over to whisper something to Galloway, who nodded grimly before rising. The prosecution calls Michael Felton, owner of the Corner Market. Felton approached the stand nervously, a slight man in his 50s with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses. After being sworn in, he perched on the edge of the witness chair, hands clasped tightly in his lap. Mr. Felton, Galloway began, could you tell the court about the security system at your store? Yes, ma'am. I installed 4 new cameras about 3 months ago after the last robbery. High definition, wide-angle lenses, motion-activated recording. And why did you feel the need for this upgrade? We'd been robbed 3 times in 18 months. Insurance was threatening to drop us unless we improved security. Galloway nodded sympathetically. Could you describe the neighborhood around your store? Has there been an increase in criminal activity? Objection, Chen called. Calls for speculation. I'll rephrase, Galloway said quickly. Mr. Felton, based on your personal experience as a business owner in that location, have you noticed changes in the area over recent years? Felton shifted uncomfortably. Well, yes. There's been more loitering, some drug dealing in the alley behind the shop. I've had to call police more frequently. On the night in question, did you see the defendant outside your store? Yes, I noticed him through the window. And did his behavior concern you in any way? Felton hesitated, his eyes flickering toward Marcus. He was just standing there, looking at his watch a lot. I didn't think much of it. Galloway frowned slightly. Did you make eye contact with him, as Officer Brennan testified? I might have. I was closing up, counting the register. If I looked out and he looked in at the same time, maybe. But you didn't call the police about him? No, ma'am. Like I said, he was just standing there. The bus stop's right outside. Galloway's strategy was failing, but she pressed on. In your experience, Mr. Felton, do people sometimes use that bus stop as an excuse to loiter near your store? Objection. Chen interjected, leading the witness. Sustained, Judge Harmon ruled. Galloway regrouped. Mr. Felton, how did you come to share the security footage with the defense? Felton straightened slightly. Mr. Washington's mother came to the store the day after his arrest. She was very upset, said her son had been wrongfully accused. When she described what happened, I remembered seeing the police car outside that night. I checked the security footage and... He trailed off. And what, Mr. Felton? And I saw that things didn't happen the way the officer said, so I made a copy for Mrs. Washington. Galloway realized she was only digging a deeper hole. No further questions, Your Honor. Chen approached the witness stand. Mr. Felton, thank you for coming forward with the security footage. Was that a difficult decision for you? Felton nodded. Honestly, yes. I depend on the police to protect my business. I was worried about repercussions. Have you experienced any repercussions since providing the footage? Felton hesitated, then answered quietly. Patrol cars drive by my store much more slowly now. Officers come in for coffee but don't talk to me like before. Nothing direct, just different. One final question. Based on what you witnessed both in person and on the security footage, did Marcus Washington appear to be doing anything illegal or threatening outside your store that night? No, sir. He was just waiting for the bus. Thank you, Mr. Felton. No further questions. Judge Harmon glanced at her watch. We'll take a 15-minute recess before the prosecution calls its next witness. During the break, the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. Marcus conferred quietly with Chen in the corner of the defense area. They're drowning, Chen observed. Galloway knows it. Hargrove knows it. The question is whether they'll cut their losses or double down. What do you mean? Marcus asked. They might offer a deal, drop the charges in exchange for you not filing a civil lawsuit against the department. Or they might bring out character witnesses, try to paint you as something other than the respected teacher you are. When court resumed, Galloway seemed to have regained some composure. The prosecution calls Dr. Robert Miller. A distinguished man in his 60s approached the stand. After establishing his credentials as a psychologist specializing in law enforcement stress responses, Galloway turned to the heart of his testimony. Dr. Miller, could you explain how stress affects memory, particularly in high-pressure situations like police encounters? Certainly, Miller replied, his academic tone lending authority to his words. Under acute stress, the brain's threat response system activates, flooding the body with hormones that enhance survival capabilities but can impair cognitive functions, including memory formation. Officers may experience perceptual distortions, time slowing down or speeding up, tunnel vision, auditory exclusion. These factors can lead to genuine memory discrepancies when recalling events. So an officer like Brennan might sincerely believe he experienced a push or an elbow strike, even if video evidence suggests otherwise? Yes, that's entirely possible. It's not fabrication, but a neurological response to perceived threat. The brain creates a narrative that aligns with the emotional experience of danger, even if details differ from objective reality. Galloway looked relieved. No further questions. Chen approached thoughtfully. Dr. Miller, is this memory distortion more likely to occur when an officer is already predisposed to perceive certain individuals as threatening? Miller shifted uncomfortably. Implicit biases can certainly influence threat perception, yes. And would these memory distortions tend to consistently favor the officer's perception of threat, rather than randomly distorting details? Research suggests there's a bias toward remembering events as more threatening than they objectively were, particularly in law enforcement contexts. One final question. If Officer Brennan genuinely experienced these memory distortions, wouldn't we expect him to be surprised or confused when confronted with video evidence contradicting his recollection, rather than defensive and evasive? Objection, Galloway called. Calls for speculation about Officer Brennan's state of mind. I'll rephrase, Chen said. Dr. Miller, in your professional experience, how do individuals typically respond when confronted with evidence contradicting their stress-altered memories? Most commonly, there's initial confusion, followed by an attempt to reconcile the contradicting information. Genuine memory distortion usually results in the person being surprised by the discrepancy. Thank you, Dr. Miller. No further questions. After Dr. Miller stepped down, Galloway conferred briefly with Hargrove, then stood. Your Honor, the prosecution requests a brief recess to confer with our team. Judge Harmon granted 30 minutes. As soon as they left the courtroom, Chen turned to Marcus. They're considering their options. This isn't going well for them. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted. Hargrove had taken Galloway's place at the prosecution table, a clear sign of the case's increased significance. Your Honor, Hargrove addressed the court. After careful consideration of the evidence presented thus far, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Washington in the interest of justice. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Marcus sat perfectly still, as if afraid any movement might reverse this unexpected turn. Judge Harmon studied Hargrove carefully. This is an unusual step at this stage of proceedings, Mr. Hargrove. Would you care to elaborate on the state's reasoning? Hargrove cleared his throat. The video evidence raises significant questions about the accuracy of the officer's testimony. While we maintain that Officer Brennan acted according to his training and genuine perception of the situation, we cannot in good conscience proceed with prosecution given the contradictory evidence before the court. Judge Harmon turned to Chen. Does the defense have any objection to dismissal of charges? No objection, Your Honor, Chen replied calmly, though his eyes betrayed his triumph. The defense welcomes the state's recognition that these charges should never have been brought. Very well, Judge Harmon declared. All charges against Marcus Washington are hereby dismissed. She turned to Marcus directly. Mr. Washington, you are free to go. The court apologizes for the ordeal you have endured. As the reality sank in, Mrs. Washington broke into tears of relief. Marcus embraced his attorney, then turned to hug his mother across the railing separating the gallery from the court floor. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed around them. Chen raised his hands for quiet. Justice was delayed but not denied today, he announced. Marcus Washington, an exemplary teacher and citizen, should never have been arrested, never have been charged, and never have had to endure this process. The video evidence spoke the truth that Officer Brennan would not. We are grateful for the court's wisdom and the prosecution's eventual recognition of the right course of action. A reporter called out, "Will Mr. Washington be filing a civil suit against the police department?" Chen glanced at Marcus, who nodded slightly. "We will be pursuing all appropriate legal remedies for the violation of Mr. Washington's civil rights, the false arrest, and the malicious prosecution he has endured. Today was about clearing his name. Tomorrow is about accountability." As cameras flashed around them, Marcus stepped forward. For the first time since his arrest, he would speak publicly about his ordeal. Marcus Washington stood before the forest of microphones, cameras flashing around him like lightning. The courthouse steps had become an impromptu press conference, the crowd growing as word spread of the case's dramatic conclusion. He took a deep breath, the weight of the past weeks visible in the tightness around his eyes despite his evident relief. "First, I want to thank my attorney, David Chen, for believing in me from the beginning," Marcus began, his voice steady. "And my mother, whose strength and faith never wavered." He reached for Mrs. Washington's hand, squeezing it gently before continuing. "What happened to me that night could have happened to any black man in Westridge. I was simply waiting for a bus after meeting with a student's family about college applications, doing my job as a teacher, serving my community. For that, I was thrown to the ground, arrested, charged with felonies, and nearly lost everything I've worked for my entire life." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I don't believe all police officers are like Officer Brennan, but a system that protects officers who lie, that dismisses complaint after complaint from black citizens, that trains officers to see threats where none exist, that system is broken and it needs to be fixed." A reporter called out, "How has this affected your teaching career?" "My school administration has been supportive, but I've been on administrative leave since my arrest. My students have been told their teacher is facing criminal charges with no context or explanation. Some of my younger students are now afraid of police officers. That breaks my heart as an educator." Another reporter asked, "What do you hope to accomplish with a civil lawsuit?" "Accountability," Marcus answered without hesitation. "Not just for Officer Brennan, but for the supervisors who enabled him, the department that trained him, and the system that protected him. Without the security camera footage, I would likely be facing years in prison based solely on an officer's false testimony. How many others don't have the benefit of video evidence?" As the questions continued, across town at the Westridge Police Department, an emergency meeting was underway. Chief Howard Baldwin sat at the head of the conference table, his expression grim as he faced his command staff. "This is a disaster," he stated flatly, tossing a preliminary report onto the table. "Not only do we have a clear case of excessive force and false testimony, but we've got documented evidence of Sergeant Reynolds dismissing legitimate complaints, particularly from minority residents. The mayor's office is demanding answers, and the Justice Department has already called about a potential pattern or practice investigation." Captain Maria Vasquez, head of Internal Affairs, spoke up. "Chief, we've been flagging Brennan's complaint pattern for 2 years. Reynolds kept overriding our recommendations for remedial training or discipline." "And why wasn't I informed?" Baldwin demanded. "With respect, sir, you were. I sent 3 separate memos about concerning patterns in the 4th District, specifically naming Brennan and 2 other officers. You approved Reynolds's judgment each time." Baldwin's face flushed. He remembered the memos, had skimmed them between budget meetings and press conferences, trusting his sergeant's assessment over the dry statistics. Now, that trust might cost him his job. "Options," he said tersely. "Give me options." The department's legal counsel, Sandra Morris, spoke up. "From a liability standpoint, we're exposed. The video is damning, and Chen will use it effectively in civil court. I recommend immediate disciplinary action against Brennan, a thorough review of Reynolds' supervision, and reaching out to Washington's attorney about settlement discussions before they file suit." "Settlement sends the message we're admitting wrongdoing," Baldwin objected. "With respect, Chief," Morris replied, "the video already did that. The question now is whether we handle this like professionals acknowledging a serious problem, or whether we dig in and make it worse." At his desk in the 4th District Station, Officer Michael Brennan stared at his computer screen, reading the internal notification of his immediate suspension pending investigation. His police union representative had already called, assuring him they would fight any disciplinary action. But Brennan wasn't thinking about his job. He was replaying the arrest in his mind, trying to reconcile his memory with the video evidence. Had he really invented the push, the elbow strike? Or had he genuinely experienced the encounter differently than what the camera showed? The distinction mattered to him, the difference between being a liar and being merely fallible. Either way, his career was likely over. 15 years of academy training had taught him to perceive threats, to control situations quickly, to trust his instincts. Not once had those lessons included considering whether implicit bias might be coloring his perception. Meanwhile, in his classroom at Westridge High School, Marcus stood in the doorway, surveying the empty desks. Principal Diana Coleman stood beside him, having welcomed him back to campus after his 3-week absence. "The students have missed you," she said warmly. "Especially your AP history class. They've been quite vocal about the substitutes' inadequacies." Marcus smiled faintly, running his hand along the edge of his desk. "I've missed them too. It's strange. Facing prison, all I could think about was never teaching again, never seeing them graduate or helping them with college essays." "Marcus," Coleman said gently, "if you need more time—" "No," he interrupted, his voice firm. "I need to be here, doing my job, showing them that the system doesn't get to determine my worth or my future." She nodded, understanding. "The school board has authorized me to offer counseling services for you and for any students who want to discuss what happened. This has affected the whole community, especially our black students who see themselves in you." "I'd like that," Marcus agreed. "It's important they see how to process this kind of trauma constructively." That evening, Marcus and Chen met at the attorney's office to discuss the civil lawsuit. The conference room walls were now covered with documents, officer training materials, department policies, complaint statistics, personnel records obtained through preliminary discovery. "The city attorney called today," Chen informed him. "They want to discuss settlement before we file the federal civil rights case." "No," Marcus said immediately. "Not yet." Chen raised an eyebrow. "It could save years of litigation, Marcus. Get you compensation sooner. This isn't just about money. Look at this." Marcus pointed to a chart showing complaint patterns across the department. "Brennan isn't an isolated case. The whole 4th District shows the same pattern. Excessive force complaints from minority residents dismissed at nearly triple the rate of complaints from white residents." Chen studied his client thoughtfully. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about my students, about their parents, about Mr. Felton at the corner market. This isn't just about one bad officer or one wrongful arrest. It's about a community living in fear of the people sworn to protect them." He stood, pacing the room as he gathered his thoughts. "If we settle quickly, the department makes some cosmetic changes, issues a press release about improved training, and everything goes back to normal. I want discovery, Chen. I want depositions from every officer in that district. I want the training manuals, the performance evaluations, the emails between supervisors discussing complaint dismissals." "You're talking about systemic reform litigation," Chen said. "That's a much longer, harder fight." "I'm a teacher," Marcus replied simply. "I'm in it for the long-term impact." Chen nodded slowly, a new respect dawning in his eyes. "I'll need to bring in additional counsel with experience in pattern or practice cases. This is bigger than my usual practice." "Whatever it takes," Marcus said firmly. "The video saved me, but what about everyone who doesn't have video evidence? Who speaks for them?" As darkness fell over Westridge, different forces were mobilizing. At the police union headquarters, representatives strategized their defense of Brennan and Reynolds. In the mayor's office, political calculations were being made about the costs, financial and electoral, of defending versus reforming the department. In community centers and church basements, activists organized around the case, planning marches and town halls to demand accountability. And in his modest apartment, Marcus Washington graded papers at his kitchen table, preparing to return to his classroom the next day. On his TV, muted in the background, his own face appeared on the evening news, standing on the courthouse steps. The chyron beneath read, "Teacher cleared of charges files civil rights lawsuit against police department." Tomorrow would bring new challenges, facing his students, enduring the whispers and stares, beginning the long process of holding a powerful institution accountable. But tonight, for the first time since his arrest, Marcus slept without nightmares. The weight of false charges lifted from his shoulders. The fight for justice was just beginning, but at least now he was fighting on his own terms. The morning bell rang at Westridge High School, students streaming through the hallways with the usual Monday chaos of slamming lockers and overlapping conversations. But today, an unusual hush fell over room 237 as students filed in for first period AP US History. Marcus Washington stood at the front of the classroom, writing the day's discussion topic on the whiteboard: Justice Systems in America, Theory versus Practice. He turned to face his students, offering a warm smile that didn't quite mask the lingering strain in his eyes. "Good morning, everyone. It's good to be back." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Zoe Chen, the class president, stood up. "Mr. Washington, we watched the news. We saw what happened to you. It wasn't right." Marcus nodded, acknowledging her words. "Thank you, Zoe. And thank you all for your support during my absence. I know you have questions, and yes, we're going to talk about what happened. But as historians, analyzing systems and patterns, not just my individual experience." Tyler Johnson, a quiet student who rarely participated, raised his hand. "My dad's a cop," he said, his voice slightly defensive. "He says most officers aren't like that Brennan guy." "I believe that's true, Tyler," Marcus replied carefully. "This isn't about vilifying all police officers. It's about examining a system that sometimes protects those who abuse their authority at the expense of those they're sworn to protect." Jamal Williams, one of his most promising students, spoke next. "My brother got stopped 3 times last month just driving to work. No reason, just routine checks. That's the system too, isn't it?" "Yes, Jamal, it is. What we're discussing today goes beyond one incident or one officer. It's about patterns, policies, and institutional practices that allow these incidents to occur repeatedly." For the next 45 minutes, Marcus guided his students through a discussion more nuanced and personal than any textbook could provide. They analyzed statistics on racial disparities in policing, discussed the history of law enforcement in America, and debated various reform proposals. Throughout, Marcus maintained his educator's perspective, challenging them to think critically rather than simply accept his experience as definitive. When the bell rang, several students lingered, approaching his desk with words of support or, in some cases, just to welcome him back. As they filed out, Principal Coleman appeared in the doorway. "That was impressive," she said. "Most people would have taken more time off after what you've been through." Marcus began organizing papers for his next class. "Teaching helps, gives me purpose, reminds me who I'm really fighting for." "The superintendent called this morning," Coleman said. "The district wants to release a statement of support for you and the civil case. They're finally taking a public stand." "Better late than never," Marcus replied with a hint of weariness. 3 weeks ago, they were debating whether to terminate me based on Brennan's false allegations. "Politics," Coleman acknowledged. "But the video changed everything. People had to take sides." "That's the problem, isn't it?" Marcus looked up at her. "Without that video, there are no sides to take. There's just an officer's word against mine, and we both know which way that usually goes." Across town at the federal courthouse, David Chen sat with his expanded legal team, now including Vanessa Rodriguez, a civil rights attorney specializing in police misconduct litigation, and Michael Terrell, a former Justice Department lawyer with experience in pattern or practice investigations. "The initial disclosures from the department are troubling," Rodriguez said, spreading documents across the conference table. "Over the past 5 years, they've received 347 excessive force complaints. Only 12 resulted in any disciplinary action. The racial breakdown of complainants is even more concerning." She pointed to a chart showing nearly 70% of complaints came from minority residents. "What about body cameras?" Terrell asked. "The department received federal funding for a full rollout 3 years ago." Chen shuffled through another stack of papers. "According to these records, Camera failures or accidental deactivations occur at 3 times the national average. And guess which district has the highest failure rate? 4th District, Rodriguez answered. Brennan and Reynolds territory. Exactly. And look at this internal memo from Captain Vasquez. Chen passed them a highlighted document. She flagged the pattern 2 years ago, recommended additional oversight for the 4th District. Chief Baldwin acknowledged receipt but took no action. This goes higher than Brennan or even Reynolds, Terrell observed. The leadership was aware and chose to look the other way. Classic deliberate indifference. The door opened and Marcus entered, still dressed in his teaching clothes. Sorry I'm late. Parent-teacher conferences ran long. How's it going back at school? Chen asked. Better than expected. The students are engaged, asking good questions. Some parents are uncomfortable with the discussions we're having, but the administration is backing me so far. Rodriguez introduced herself, then laid out their findings. Marcus, based on what we're seeing in discovery, we believe your case could be the foundation for a much broader consent decree, not just compensation for your individual damages, but court-mandated reforms throughout the department. That's exactly what I was hoping for, Marcus said, pulling up a chair. What's our next step? Depositions, Terrell explained. Starting with Brennan and Reynolds, then working our way up the chain of command. We need to establish what the department knew about these patterns, when they knew it, and why they failed to act. Meanwhile, in a modest suburban home, Officer Michael Brennan sat across from his wife Karen as she processed the latest development. Suspended without pay? She repeated, her voice rising in distress. Michael, we have the mortgage payment due next week. Lily's braces installment. How are we supposed to? The union's helping with legal fees, Brennan cut in, though his voice lacked conviction. And there's a chance for reinstatement after the internal investigation. Karen's expression made it clear she didn't believe that, and neither did he. The department was distancing itself, preparing to sacrifice him to protect the brass. 20 years of following protocol, doing what he was trained to do, and now he was the scapegoat. You should have just admitted you made a mistake, Karen said quietly. When the video first came out, if you'd acknowledged that you overreacted, apologized, and admit what? Brennan's voice hardened. That I'm some kind of racist? That I targeted him because he's black? You know that's not who I am. I know you're not, she agreed. But Michael, what I saw on that video, that wasn't you either. Not the man I know. Her words struck deeper than she realized. Brennan had been wrestling with the same contradiction. He didn't consider himself racist. He had black colleagues he respected, had coached his daughter's diverse soccer team for years. Yet he couldn't deny that something had triggered his aggressive response to Washington that night, something that went beyond conscious thought. The ringing phone interrupted their conversation. It was Reynolds calling with an update. Internal Affairs is interviewing everyone in the district, he reported grimly. They're pulling all complaint records going back 5 years, reviewing body cam footage, the works. The chief's in full damage control mode. What about the civil case? Brennan asked. Union lawyers say we should expect depositions within the month. Listen, Mike, they're going to try to pit us against each other. You need to stick to your training defense. You responded based on your experience and perception of threat. After hanging up, Brennan stared at the wall, wondering how much of his 15-year career had been built on perceptions that didn't match reality. In the community room of New Hope Baptist Church, Mrs. Washington addressed the largest crowd the space had seen in years. Community members filled every chair, lined the walls, and spilled into the hallway, united by concern over the Washington case and what it represented. My son was one of the lucky ones, she said, her voice strong despite her petite frame. He had video evidence. He had an education and resources to fight back. But how many of our children don't have those advantages? How many have pleaded guilty to crimes they didn't commit because they saw no path to justice? Pastor James Miller nodded solemnly beside her. This isn't just Marcus Washington's fight. This is about our community demanding accountability, transparency, and fundamental change in how policing happens in our neighborhoods. Representatives from the NAACP, the Urban League, and local advocacy groups presented a unified list of demands: an independent civilian review board with subpoena power, mandatory body cameras with penalties for deactivation, transparent disciplinary procedures, and community involvement in officer training. As the meeting concluded, Mrs. Washington found herself surrounded by other mothers, sharing stories of sons and daughters harassed, detained, or arrested under questionable circumstances. With each account, her resolve strengthened. Marcus's case had opened a door, creating space for these long-silenced voices. They wouldn't let that door close again. The conference room in David Chen's law office had been transformed into a makeshift deposition suite. A court reporter sat quietly in the corner, her fingers poised above her stenography machine. A video camera on a tripod captured the proceedings from another angle. At the head of the long table, Officer Michael Brennan sat rigidly beside his union attorney, Paul Weathers, a veteran defender of police officers in civil litigation. Across from them, Vanessa Rodriguez opened a folder containing Brennan's personnel file, complaint history, and transcripts from the criminal trial. Marcus Washington sat beside her, his presence a silent reminder of why they were all there. "Officer Brennan," Rodriguez began after preliminary matters were handled, "I'd like to start by reviewing your training on reasonable suspicion and probable cause. Could you explain the standards you were taught for initiating a stop?" Brennan cleared his throat. "We're trained to look for specific, articulable facts that would lead a reasonable officer to believe criminal activity is occurring or about to occur. And on the night you stopped Mr. Washington, what specific, articulable facts led you to believe he was engaged in criminal activity? As I testified previously, I observed behavior consistent with someone casing a business for robbery. Pacing, repeated glances into the store, checking for witnesses or police presence." Rodriguez slid the security footage still frame across the table. "This image shows Mr. Washington standing at a marked bus stop checking his watch. Do you see the pacing you described in your report?" Brennan studied the image, his jaw tight. "The video doesn't capture the full context of my observations." "In fact, Officer Brennan, the video shows nearly 5 minutes of Mr. Washington's behavior before your arrival, and at no point does he engage in the activities you described in your report. Would you agree with that statement?" Weathers interjected, "My client has already acknowledged that stress may have affected his perception and memory of the event." "Yes," Rodriguez replied smoothly, "but I'm asking about his written report, filed after the incident when any acute stress would have subsided. This report," she placed the document before him, "where he specifically claims Mr. Washington was pacing suspiciously and appeared to be casing the location. Was that report also affected by stress?" Brennan shifted uncomfortably. "I wrote the report based on my recollection at the time." "Let's move on to your use of force training," Rodriguez continued. "You testified that you perceived Mr. Washington as threatening, despite the video showing him with hands visible and making no aggressive movements. Could you explain what specific pre-attack indicators you observed? His stance, the way he tensed when I approached, his failure to immediately comply with my commands. Officer Brennan, are you aware that studies have shown black subjects are often perceived as more threatening than white subjects exhibiting identical behaviors?" "Objection," Weathers interrupted. "You're asking for speculation about academic studies my client may not be familiar with." "I'll rephrase," Rodriguez said. "Officer Brennan, in your 15 years on the force, have you received any training specifically addressing implicit bias in threat assessment?" Brennan hesitated. "We've had some diversity training modules." "Could you describe their content and duration?" It's a 4-hour online course required every 2 years. Cultural sensitivity, community relations, that sort of thing. Rodriguez made a note. And in your department's use of force training, approximately how many hours are dedicated to de-escalation techniques versus physical control tactics? Brennan's discomfort was evident. I don't recall the exact breakdown. Rodriguez slid another document across the table, the department's training curriculum. According to this, officers receive 40 hours of physical control and defensive tactics training annually, compared to 2 hours of de-escalation training. Does that align with your experience? That sounds about right, Brennan admitted. The deposition continued for 4 grueling hours, with Rodriguez methodically working through Brennan's training, complaint history, and the details of his encounter with Marcus. Throughout, Marcus remained mostly silent, watching the officer who had nearly destroyed his life gradually lose his certainty under the weight of documented facts. During a brief break, Chen pulled Marcus aside. "You okay? I know this isn't easy." Marcus nodded. It's strange. Watching him try to justify what he did, seeing him struggle when confronted with the evidence. I expected to feel anger, but mostly I just feel sad. He really believes he was doing his job the way he was trained to do it. That's exactly what we need to establish, Chen replied. This isn't just about Brennan. It's about the system that created him. When the deposition resumed, Rodriguez turned to a new line of questioning. Officer Brennan, of the 17 civilian complaints filed against you, 14 came from black residents of Westridge. Do you see that as significant? The 4th District has a higher percentage of black residents than other areas of the city. Actually, Rodriguez countered, according to census data, the 4th District is 27% black, yet 82% of your complaints come from black residents. How do you explain that disparity? Before Brennan could answer, the door opened and Michael Terrell entered, placing a note before Rodriguez. She read it quickly, then addressed Weathers. Counsel, we've just received additional documents from the department that directly relate to Officer Brennan. I'd like to introduce them into the record. Weathers frowned. What documents? Internal affairs investigations that weren't included in the initial disclosure. She handed copies to everyone at the table. 3 separate investigations into Officer Brennan's use of force, all marked unfounded by Sergeant Reynolds, despite investigator recommendations for disciplinary action. Brennan paled, looking to Weathers for guidance. We'll need time to review these, Weathers said stiffly. Of course, Rodriguez agreed. We can suspend for today and reconvene tomorrow. But I should inform you that we've also scheduled Sergeant Reynolds' deposition for tomorrow afternoon, and Chief Baldwin for the day after. After Brennan and his attorney departed, the legal team gathered to review the new documents. These IA reports are damning, Terrell observed. The investigators clearly recommended discipline in each case, but Reynolds overrode them each time. And look at the language he uses. Officer acting within reasonable tactical guidelines. No substantive evidence of excessive force. Almost identical phrasing across 3 separate incidents. It's like he had a template for dismissing complaints, Chen added. Marcus studied the reports silently, each one describing an encounter between Brennan and a black resident that had escalated to physical force. The pattern was unmistakable and sickening. The next day, Sergeant James Reynolds took the seat Brennan had occupied, flanked by the same union attorney plus a lawyer from the city's office. His demeanor was defensive from the outset, his answers clipped and precise. Sergeant Reynolds, Rodriguez began, as Officer Brennan's direct supervisor, you were responsible for reviewing his use of force incidents and civilian complaints, correct? Yes, that's part of my duties. And in 17 instances over 5 years, you found no cause for disciplinary action or additional training. Is that accurate? Each complaint was thoroughly investigated according to department guidelines. Rodriguez placed the internal affairs reports before him. These investigations, conducted by Captain Vasquez's team, all recommended disciplinary action against Officer Brennan. Yet you overruled those recommendations. Could you explain your reasoning? Reynolds straightened, his expression hardening. IA makes recommendations based on policy guidelines. As the officer's supervisor, I consider the totality of circumstances, including the officer's overall performance and the specific challenges of policing the 4th District. The specific challenges, Rodriguez repeated. Could you elaborate on what you mean by that? The 4th District has higher crime rates, more gang activity, more volatile situations that can quickly turn dangerous for officers. And would you say those volatile situations are more common with certain residents of the district? The trap was set, and Reynolds walked directly into it. Statistically, yes. Our crime data shows higher involvement of African American males in violent incidents, which naturally leads to more frequent and sometimes more intense police interactions. A subtle shift occurred in the room. The court reporter's fingers paused momentarily. The city attorney closed his eyes briefly in resignation. Reynolds seemed to realize his mistake too late. So you're testifying, Rodriguez continued, her voice deceptively calm, that you apply different standards when evaluating officers' use of force against black residents because you expect those interactions to be more intense. That's not what I said, Reynolds backtracked. I evaluate each incident on its specific facts. Yet in 17 incidents involving Officer Brennan, many with strikingly similar fact patterns to Mr. Washington's case, you found no cause for concern. How do you reconcile that with the video evidence we've seen? Reynolds glanced at his attorneys, then back at Rodriguez. The Washington incident was an anomaly. An anomaly, Rodriguez repeated, or simply the first time Officer Brennan's actions were caught on camera. The city attorney's office was in crisis mode. In a spacious conference room overlooking the Westridge skyline, City Attorney Elizabeth Palmer faced Mayor Robert Wilson and 3 grim-faced city council members. The deposition transcripts lay scattered across the table between them. How bad is it? The mayor asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Palmer didn't sugarcoat her assessment. Catastrophic. Reynolds's deposition alone could cost the city millions. He essentially admitted to applying a different standard of oversight based on racial demographics. That's textbook evidence of discriminatory practices. Councilman Davis, representing the 4th District, leaned forward. Can we distance the city from the individual officers? Argue this was rogue behavior, not policy? That defense collapsed when Chief Baldwin was deposed yesterday, Palmer replied, sliding another transcript across the table. He acknowledged receiving multiple warnings about disproportionate force in the 4th District and taking no substantive action. Under federal law, that constitutes deliberate indifference. What are our options? Mayor Wilson asked. Settlement is our best course, Palmer advised. Washington's legal team isn't just seeking monetary damages. They want structural reforms, consent decree, independent monitoring, the works. If we fight this in court and lose, which is likely given the evidence, a federal judge will impose those reforms anyway, probably more severely, and the financial penalties will be substantially higher. The police union will fight any significant reforms, Councilwoman Harris pointed out. They're already running ads claiming this whole case is an attack on law enforcement. The union doesn't control city policy, Palmer countered. And frankly, their influence is weakening as more evidence emerges. Public opinion has shifted dramatically since the video went viral. The mayor stood, pacing the room. He was facing re-election in 8 months, and this crisis threatened to define his entire administration. Draft a settlement proposal, he decided finally. Include reasonable reforms we can actually implement. But I want to speak with Washington personally before we move forward. Sir, Palmer cautioned, speaking directly to a plaintiff in active litigation. Not about the case specifics, Wilson clarified. I want to understand what he really wants. What would constitute justice in his eyes? He turned to Councilman Davis. And I want to hear from your constituents. Town hall, community forum, whatever works. We need to listen to the people most affected by these practices. Across town, Marcus Washington sat in his classroom during lunch period, reviewing essays while absently eating a sandwich. A knock at the door interrupted his grading. Got a minute? David Chen asked, stepping into the room. Always, Marcus replied, setting down his red pen. Any updates? The mayor wants to meet with you, not to discuss settlement specifics, but to hear your perspective on what meaningful reform would look like. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That's unexpected. It is. Palmer's probably having kittens over it, but it could be a good sign. Wilson might be ready to make real changes rather than just throw money at the problem and hope it goes away. Or it could be a PR move, Marcus said skeptically. Photo op with the wrongfully arrested black teacher to show he's listening before the election. Possibly, Chen acknowledged. But either way, it gives you a direct line to the decision maker, an opportunity to advocate not just for yourself, but for the community. Marcus considered this, then nodded. Set it up. But I want my mother there too. And Pastor Miller. This isn't just my fight. After Chen left, Marcus noticed Jamal Williams hovering in the doorway, clearly having overheard part of the conversation. Mr. Washington, can I talk to you for a second? Of course, Jamal. What's on your mind? The teenager entered hesitantly, clutching his backpack strap. I heard about your case on the news again. They said you're trying to change how the police department works. That's part of it, yes. Jamal seemed to gather his courage. The night before you got arrested, I got stopped by police too. 2 officers from the 4th District. They said I matched the description of someone who stole a car. His voice tightened. They made me lie face down on the sidewalk while they searched my backpack. Found my history homework with your name on it, actually. Marcus felt a cold weight settling in his stomach. Did they hurt you? No, Jamal said quickly. But they kept saying I was lucky they were being nice about it. Made me feel like I'd done something wrong just by walking home. He paused. I never told my parents. Didn't want them to worry more than they already do. Jamal, I'm so sorry that happened to you, Marcus said softly. Would you be willing to make a statement about this? It could help our case. The student hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I think I would. If it helps make sure other kids don't get treated that way. Later that afternoon, the New Hope Baptist Church community room was filled beyond capacity for an emergency town hall meeting. Councilman Davis had organized the forum in response to the mayor's request, but the turnout had exceeded everyone's expectations. Residents of the 4th District filled every seat, lined the walls, and spilled out into the hallway. News cameras captured the scene as speaker after speaker approached the microphone. My son was stopped 3 times in 1 month, a middle-aged woman declared. Honor roll student, never been in trouble. Each time they said he looked suspicious. What they meant was, he looked black. An elderly man spoke next, his voice shaking with emotion. I've lived in this neighborhood for 47 years. Used to be we respected the police, and they respected us. Now my grandsons are afraid to walk to the corner store. That ain't right. That ain't the America I served for. Marcus sat in the front row beside his mother, listening as community members shared experiences that echoed his own. The stories varied in detail, but followed the same pattern. Minor encounters escalated by police, dignity stripped away, complaints ignored or dismissed. A collective trauma reflected in individual experiences. When it was his turn to speak, Marcus approached the microphone with the careful deliberation of a teacher choosing his words. "What happened to me wasn't unique," he began. "That's the most important thing to understand. The only unusual aspect was that a security camera captured the truth. But cameras can't be our only protection against injustice." He looked around the room, making eye contact with elderly residents who had lived through the civil rights era, with parents worried for their children, with teenagers like Jamal who were learning too early about the weight of others' perceptions. Real reform isn't just about punishing individual officers. It's about changing the culture and systems that shape their behavior. It's about accountability at every level, from patrol officers to supervisors to the chief's office. It's about training that emphasizes de-escalation over dominance, communication over control. Councilman Davis, taking notes at the side of the stage, looked increasingly overwhelmed by the scope of the community's grievances. "Most importantly," Marcus continued, "reform means giving our community a meaningful voice in how we're policed. Not just listening sessions after a crisis, but ongoing involvement in policy development, officer training, and oversight. We don't want special treatment. We want equal treatment, the presumption of innocence, the benefit of the doubt, the basic dignity that every citizen deserves." The applause that followed his words was thunderous. As Marcus returned to his seat, Mrs. Washington squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered. The forum continued for another 2 hours, the testimonies growing more emotional as the evening progressed. Police supporters occasionally spoke, defending the department and arguing against what they saw as anti-police sentiment, but they were a distinct minority. The community's verdict was clear. The status quo was unacceptable. As the meeting concluded, Pastor Miller addressed the gathering. "This is just the beginning. The Washington case has opened a door, but it's up to all of us to walk through it together. Change doesn't come from one lawsuit or one town hall. It comes from sustained, organized community action." Outside, reporters clustered around Marcus, shouting questions about the upcoming meeting with the mayor and the status of settlement negotiations. He answered briefly, redirecting attention to the community coalition that was forming around the case. "This isn't about me anymore," he told them. "It's about a system that needs fundamental change, and a community that deserves nothing less." The mayor's office occupied the top floor of City Hall, a stately building that had witnessed generations of Westridge's political history. Marcus Washington had passed it countless times, but never entered until today. Now he sat at a polished conference table alongside his mother, Pastor Miller, and his legal team, facing Mayor Wilson and his advisors. "Mr. Washington," the mayor began, "I appreciate your willingness to meet directly. I've reviewed the depositions, the video evidence, and the community feedback from Councilman Davis's forum. Before our legal teams dive into settlement specifics, I wanted to hear directly from you what justice looks like in this case." Marcus studied the mayor carefully. Robert Wilson had governed Westridge for 6 years, a moderate Democrat who prided himself on balancing fiscal responsibility with social progress. His record on policing had been mixed: increased funding for community outreach programs, but also staunch support for the department whenever controversies arose. "Justice," Marcus repeated thoughtfully. Justice would have been not being thrown to the ground while waiting for a bus. Justice would have been Officer Brennan approaching me respectfully, asking questions, and listening to my answers. Justice would have been Sergeant Reynolds properly investigating the 17 complaints before mine, so that patterns could be addressed before they affected someone else. The mayor nodded, absorbing this. "I understand your personal experience, and it was inexcusable. But looking forward, Marcus interrupted gently. Justice means ensuring that what happened to me doesn't happen to my students, to my neighbors, to anyone in Westridge. That requires structural change, not just removing a few problematic officers." Pastor Miller spoke next, his deep voice carrying the moral authority of his position. "Mayor Wilson, our community has lost faith in the systems meant to protect us. Rebuilding that trust requires more than cosmetic reforms or financial settlements. It requires a fundamental reimagining of public safety in our city." Mrs. Washington, who had been quietly observing, added her perspective. "When Marcus was arrested, I called every official I could think of, left messages, sent emails. Not one response until that security footage went public. That silence spoke volumes about whose voices matter in this city." The mayor had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Communication failures are part of what we need to address, certainly." "With respect, Mayor," Marcus said, "this goes beyond communication failures. The depositions revealed systemic problems, biased enforcement patterns, inadequate oversight, a culture that protects officers at the expense of the community. Addressing those issues requires specific, measurable reforms with real accountability mechanisms." David Chen opened a folder, sliding a document across the table. "We've prepared a detailed proposal outlining the reforms we believe are necessary. They're ambitious, but achievable." Mayor Wilson skimmed the document, his expression growing more concerned with each page. Some of these demands would require renegotiating the police union contract. Others would need substantial budget allocations. "The cost of reform is far less than the cost of continued injustice," Vanessa Rodriguez pointed out, "both in human terms and in financial liability to the city." The mayor's chief of staff leaned in, whispering something in his ear. Wilson nodded, then addressed the group again. "I appreciate your thoroughness. Our legal team will need to review these proposals in detail, but I want you to know that I'm committed to meaningful change, not just settling this case and moving on." "With respect, Mayor," Marcus replied. "We've heard similar promises before. What's different this time?" The mayor considered this challenge, then made a decision. "What's different is that I'm creating an independent police reform commission with binding authority to implement changes. And I'd like you, Mr. Washington, to serve as one of its members." The offer caught Marcus by surprise. "I'm a history teacher, not a policy expert." "You're a community member who has experienced these issues firsthand," Wilson countered. "And based on your thoughtful approach to this case, I believe you could help bridge the divide between the department and the community." After the meeting concluded, Marcus and his team gathered at Chen's office to debrief. "The mayor's offer is significant," Rodriguez observed. "A reform commission with actual authority could implement most of the changes we're seeking." "If it actually has binding power," Chen cautioned, "we'd need to see the commission's charter, confirm its independence from police department influence." "And ensure diverse representation," Mrs. Washington added. "Not just the usual political appointees." Marcus had been quiet, processing the meeting. It feels like a political calculation on Wilson's part. He sees which way the wind is blowing and wants to position himself ahead of his re-election campaign. "Probably," Chen agreed. "But does his motivation matter if the results are the same?" "It matters for sustainability," Marcus argued. "Reforms based on political expediency can be reversed just as easily when political winds shift. We need institutional changes that will outlast the current administration." Later that evening, an unexpected visitor arrived at Marcus's apartment. Officer Michael Brennan stood awkwardly at the door, out of uniform, his expression a mixture of discomfort and determination. "Mr. Washington," he began stiffly, "I know this is irregular. I'm not supposed to contact you directly during litigation, but I needed to. I felt I should." Marcus stood in the doorway, genuinely surprised. "Officer Brennan, does your attorney know you're here?" "No," Brennan admitted. "And I'm not here to discuss the case specifics. I've been doing a lot of thinking since the depositions. About my training, my perceptions, the way I've been approaching my job." He seemed to struggle for words, then continued. I've spent 15 years believing I was one of the good ones, that I treated everyone fairly, that the complaints against me were just part of policing tough neighborhoods. The video forced me to confront a different reality. Marcus studied the man who had nearly destroyed his life, seeing not the confident officer from the witness stand, but someone grappling with painful self-reflection. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Brennan clarified quickly. "I don't have that right, but I wanted you to know that I'm working with the department's new training consultant, helping them identify the flaws in our approach, using my mistakes to hopefully prevent others from making the same ones." Marcus wasn't sure how to respond. Part of him appreciated the gesture, recognized the courage it took. Another part remained wary, skeptical of convenient conversions amid legal pressure. "Thank you for telling me," he said finally. "Change has to start somewhere, and self-awareness is an important step." Brennan nodded, seeming to understand the measured response. "That's all I wanted to say. I won't take more of your time." As Brennan turned to leave, Marcus found himself asking, "What made you become a police officer in the first place?" The question seemed to catch Brennan off guard. "I wanted to help people," he answered after a moment. "My uncle was a cop. Growing up, I saw how he was respected in his neighborhood, how people turned to him when they needed help. That's what I thought policing was about." "Maybe it still can be," Marcus suggested quietly, "with the right approach." Their conversation lingered in Marcus's thoughts as he prepared for the next day's negotiations. The human complexity of the situation was becoming clearer. Brennan wasn't simply a villain, Reynolds wasn't purely corrupt, and even the most well-intentioned reforms wouldn't create instant transformation. Change would require sustained effort on multiple fronts: policy revisions, training improvements, cultural shifts, and ongoing community involvement. The next morning, the full settlement conference began at the federal courthouse. City Attorney Palmer presented the mayor's formal response to their reform proposals: acceptance of many key points, modifications to others, and requests for extended implementation timelines on the most ambitious demands. "The city is prepared to establish the Police Reform Commission immediately," Palmer announced, "with binding authority to implement policy changes, independent investigative powers for complaints, and a diverse membership including significant community representation." Additional proposals included mandatory body cameras with strict penalties for deactivation, revised use of force policies emphasizing de-escalation, implicit bias training conducted by independent experts, and a complete overhaul of the complaint investigation process. "As for financial compensation," Palmer continued, "the city offers $1.5 million to Mr. Washington for damages, legal fees, and the trauma he experienced." Chen looked to Marcus, who gave a slight nod. The amount was substantial, more than they had initially expected, but as they had discussed repeatedly, this case had never been primarily about money. "We accept the financial terms," Chen responded. "Regarding the reforms, we have some concerns about implementation timelines and accountability mechanisms that need to be addressed." For the next several hours, the attorneys negotiated specific language, enforcement provisions, and monitoring requirements. Marcus participated actively, ensuring that community perspectives remained central to the agreement. By late afternoon, they had reached consensus on most points. The settlement would include both immediate actions and longer-term structural changes, with clear benchmarks and independent oversight to ensure compliance. As they prepared to formalize the agreement, Marcus felt a complex mixture of emotions: satisfaction at the tangible reforms they had secured, lingering anger about the injustice that made them necessary, and cautious hope that meaningful change might actually be possible. 6 months after the settlement agreement was signed, Marcus Washington stood on the steps of City Hall, watching as Mayor Wilson cut the ceremonial ribbon to officially launch the Westridge Police Reform Commission. Camera flashes captured the moment as the diverse group of commissioners, including SMIRKS, community activists, police representatives, and civil rights experts, gathered for their first public appearance. This commission represents a new chapter in Westridge's approach to public safety, the mayor announced, with binding authority to implement reforms, independent investigative powers, and a mandate to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. SMIRKS studied the faces in the crowd, community members who had shared their stories at town halls, students like Jamal who had come to support their teacher, officers watching with expressions ranging from skepticism to cautious optimism. Change was never simple, never linear. The settlement had been just the beginning of a much longer journey. In the months since the agreement, progress had been visible but uneven. The police department had implemented mandatory body cameras with strict activation protocols. Use of force incidents had declined by nearly 30%. A new complaint investigation process, overseen by civilians rather than fellow officers, had resulted in more substantiated findings and appropriate disciplinary actions. But resistance remained. The police union had fought several reforms through legal challenges and public messaging campaigns. Some veteran officers had taken early retirement rather than adapt to new requirements. Old habits and entrenched perspectives couldn't be transformed overnight, no matter how carefully crafted the policies. After the ceremony, SMIRKS made his way through the crowd, stopping to speak with Mrs. Diaz, whose son's complaint against the department had been one of the first reviewed under the new system. "They actually listened this time," she told him, her expression a mixture of surprise and vindication. "The investigator came to our home, took detailed statements, followed up on everything. The officer was suspended and required to complete additional training. That's exactly how the system should work," SMIRKS replied, genuinely pleased. Small victories mattered. Individual instances where justice functioned properly, where voices previously ignored were finally heard. Near the edge of the gathering, he noticed Michael Brennan standing apart from the other officers, watching the proceedings with an unreadable expression. Their paths had crossed occasionally over the past months. Brennan had been reinstated after a suspension and retraining, now assigned to the Community Engagement Unit, a decision that had initially generated controversy but was proving unexpectedly productive. SMIRKS approached him, maintaining the careful professional distance they had established. "Officer Brennan." "Mr. Washington." Brennan nodded respectfully. "Congratulations on the commission launch." "Thank you. I understand you've been working with the training division on the new de-escalation protocols." "Yes," Brennan confirmed. "Using my experience as a case study, essentially. What went wrong, what I should have done differently, how biases affect perception." He hesitated, then added, "It's not comfortable work, but it feels necessary." SMIRKS studied him thoughtfully. Brennan's journey was complicated, a man forced to confront his own prejudices and failures in the most public way possible. He wasn't a villain in a simplistic morality tale, but a product of flawed systems now struggling toward something better. The settlement had included provisions for restorative justice approaches, creating spaces for officers to acknowledge harm without career-ending consequences when they demonstrated genuine commitment to change. "The students ask about you sometimes," SMIRKS said. "They want to know if people can really change." "What do you tell them?" "That change is possible but never easy, that it requires honest self-reflection and sustained effort." He paused. "That we should judge people not just by their mistakes, but by how they respond to them." Brennan nodded slowly, understanding the measured assessment. Neither absolution nor permanent condemnation, but recognition of a difficult process underway. Across the plaza, Sergeant Reynolds was noticeably absent. His deposition testimony had effectively ended his career. He had opted for retirement rather than face disciplinary proceedings. Chief Baldwin had been replaced through a nationwide search that emphasized community relations experience and reform credentials. The new chief, Carmen Ramirez, had approached her role with a willingness to acknowledge past failures while working toward meaningful improvements. That evening, Marcus returned to New Hope Baptist Church for a community update meeting. The same room that had hosted angry, pain-filled testimonies 6 months earlier now buzzed with a different energy. Not naive optimism, but the determined focus of people engaged in long-term collective action. The commission is just one tool, Marcus reminded the gathering. Its effectiveness depends on our continued involvement, our willingness to monitor progress, and our persistence when challenges arise. Pastor Miller nodded in agreement. This is marathon work, not a sprint. We're dismantling and rebuilding systems that have been in place for generations. Throughout the meeting, residents shared both positive developments and ongoing concerns. New training protocols were showing promising results, but discriminatory traffic stops continued in some areas. The Civilian Oversight Board was functioning effectively, but some officers still turned off body cameras at critical moments. The 4th District had a new commander committed to community policing, but deep-rooted trust issues remained. "We've made real progress," Mrs. Washington observed toward the end of the meeting. "But we can't become complacent. One case, one settlement, one commission can't fix everything. We need to keep showing up, keep speaking truth, keep demanding better." The following Monday, Marcus welcomed his AP US history students with a new lesson plan on his desk. Civil rights and police reform, historical patterns and contemporary movements. Teaching had always been his first calling, and now his personal experience had deepened his approach to these complex historical issues. "Who can tell me about the relationship between individual cases and systemic change throughout history?" he asked as the class settled. Jamal raised his hand. "Individual stories help people connect emotionally to bigger issues, like how Emmett Till's murder galvanized people during the civil rights movement." "Exactly," Marcus nodded. "Or how Rodney King's beating being captured on video forced a national conversation about police brutality. Today, we're going to examine how specific incidents throughout American history have catalyzed broader movements for justice, and how those movements have created meaningful, though often incomplete, change." As he guided his students through the lesson, Marcus reflected on his own place in this historical continuum. His case had created an opening for reform in Westridge, just as other cases had in other cities. The work was nowhere near complete, but each step forward mattered, each improved policy, each officer who approached their job differently, each young person who understood both the reality of injustice and the possibility of transformation. After school, Marcus drove to the corner market for the first time since his arrest. He had avoided the location for months, the memory of that night too raw, too visceral. But today felt different, a deliberate reclaiming of space. Michael Felton looked up in surprise as Marcus entered the store. "Mr. Washington, good to see you." "Mr. Felton, just wanted to thank you again for coming forward with that security footage. It made all the difference." The store owner nodded, understanding the significance. "How are things going with the commission and all that?" "Progress is slower than I'd like, but it's happening. The important thing is that people are paying attention now, demanding better." As Marcus left the store, he paused at the bus stop where everything had changed. The security camera that had captured the truth still hung above the entrance, its presence now a reminder that accountability was possible, that evidence could speak louder than authority. He checked his watch, just enough time to make it to City Hall for the Commission's working session on revising search and seizure protocols. The bus arrived right on schedule, its doors opening to welcome him aboard. As he took a seat, Marcus noticed a young officer on community patrol nearby, watching the bus stop without suspicion or aggression, simply present and aware. A small change, perhaps. a single moment unremarkable in its normalcy. But in that ordinary interaction lay the seed of something profound, the possibility of a community where safety and dignity coexisted, where authority came with accountability, where justice wasn't just an ideal, but a lived reality. The work continued, imperfect and ongoing. But as the bus pulled away from the corner market, Marcus Washington allowed himself to feel something that had been in short supply throughout this journey. Hope, tempered by realism but genuine nonetheless. Change was happening, step by difficult step, and he was helping to guide it forward.